How do you think that went?
Well, that went great.
You do?
Did you know? Apparently you did not.
No, I did.
I thought we were pretty questions.
But every time I would try to jump in, I got pushed off to the side, so I don't want you to think that I'm not acting.
The incident begins with what should be one of the most routine interactions in American policing, a suspected shoplifting case involving items worth less than $14. But within minutes, this encounter transforms into something far darker. A violent arrest that fractures bones, traumatizes a vulnerable elderly woman, and ultimately exposes systemic failures within an entire police department. What makes this case particularly significant is not just the excessive force used, but the complete breakdown of professional judgment at every level of law enforcement response. Karen Garner, 73 years old, walks out of a Walmart in Loveland, Colorado, carrying merchandise totaling $13.88. She has not paid for these items. Store employees stop her immediately. This is where the first critical decision point occurs, a moment that receives almost no attention in the broader narrative, but contains enormous implications for everything that follows. When confronted by Walmart staff, Garner attempts to pay. She reaches for her credit card, offering it to the employees. Her intent to resolve the situation peacefully is clear and documented. But the employees refuse this resolution. They take the merchandise back and then make a choice that escalates the situation beyond any reasonable proportion. They call the police. This decision deserves scrutiny because it reflects a broader societal tendency to criminalize minor infractions rather than resolve them through proportionate means. Garner no longer possesses the merchandise. The store has recovered its property. No actual loss has occurred. Yet the machinery of law enforcement is set into motion anyway, transforming what could have been a resolved misunderstanding into a criminal investigation. The Walmart employee who places that call doesn't just report an incident. They actively request that police arrest this elderly woman. This choice, made by a civilian acting as a de facto extension of law enforcement authority, initiates a chain of events that will result in broken bones, lasting trauma, and millions of dollars in taxpayer liability. When Officer Austin Hopp receives the call and begins searching for Garner, he's operating under information that should immediately raise questions about proportionality. The alleged theft has already been resolved. The property has been returned. The suspect is an elderly woman walking away from the scene, not fleeing in a vehicle or demonstrating any threat to public safety. These facts should inform every aspect of how the contact unfolds. They should trigger a measured, de-escalatory approach focused on investigation rather than immediate detention. But Hopp's response suggests a completely different operational mindset. One focused on control, compliance, and the assertion of authority rather than actual public safety. The moment Hopp locates Garner walking along the roadside, his approach methodology becomes the second critical failure point. He activates his lights and siren, creating an immediate atmosphere of emergency and threat where none actually exists. This is not a violent felony stop. This is not an armed suspect. This is an elderly woman suspected of attempting to take $14 worth of merchandise from a store that has already recovered its property. The use of emergency signals in this context serves no legitimate law enforcement purpose. It does, however, serve to justify in Hopp's mind the aggressive tactics that follow, creating a performative sense of danger that will later be used to rationalize excessive force. When Hopp makes contact with Garner, the interaction reveals something deeply troubling about his understanding of communication and de-escalation. Garner exhibits clear signs of confusion. Her body language is non-threatening. She shrugs repeatedly, a universal gesture of incomprehension or uncertainty. She does not adopt an aggressive posture. She does not make threatening statements. She does not attempt to run. Yet Hop's response treats her as though she is actively resisting arrest and posing a physical threat. This disconnect between the actual situation and Hop's perception of it represents a fundamental failure of professional judgment. The concept of resistance in law enforcement has become dangerously expansive, and this case illustrates why that expansion is so problematic. True resistance involves active, intentional opposition to lawful orders, physically fighting, attempting to flee, or taking actions that genuinely threaten officer safety. What Hop characterizes as resistance is actually confusion, fear, and the instinctive responses of a person who doesn't understand what's happening or why. When Garner says she's going home, she's not defying a lawful order. She's expressing the only coherent thought her compromised cognitive abilities can produce in a moment of stress and confusion. Hop's decision to immediately escalate to physical force demonstrates a complete absence of the professional skills that should define modern policing. There is no attempt to slow down the interaction. There is no effort to assess whether Garner might be experiencing a medical or mental health crisis. There is no consideration given to alternative approaches that might achieve compliance without violence. Instead, Hop moves directly to grabbing, twisting, and forcing Garner to the ground with a level of aggression that would be questionable even if she were a young, physically capable suspect actively fighting him. The violence of the takedown cannot be overstated. Garner weighs approximately 80 pounds. She stands at a height that makes her physically non-threatening to any adult, let alone a trained law enforcement officer. Yet Hop applies force sufficient to dislocate her shoulder, fracture her humerus, and sprain her wrist. These are not minor injuries that result from a controlled professional use of appropriate force. These are serious injuries that result from violent, uncontrolled aggression applied to a frail body that cannot withstand such treatment. The fact that Hop later characterizes this interaction as safe detention reveals either deliberate dishonesty or a disturbing inability to accurately assess his own actions. Throughout this initial contact, Garner repeatedly states that she wants to go home. This phrase, uttered multiple times, should serve as a critical diagnostic indicator to any officer with proper training in crisis intervention or mental health response. It's not defiance. It's not a refusal to comply with lawful orders. It's the verbal expression of cognitive impairment, confusion, and fear. A person with dementia or other cognitive disabilities often fixates on familiar concepts when overwhelmed. Home represents safety, normalcy, the known world. The repetition of this phrase is clinically significant, and any officer trained to recognize signs of mental illness should immediately identify it as such. But Hop doesn't recognize these signs, or if he does, he chooses to ignore them. His response treats Garner's statements as willful noncompliance rather than symptoms of an underlying condition that requires a different approach. This failure represents a breakdown not just of individual judgment, but of institutional training. Modern policing standards emphasize the importance of recognizing and appropriately responding to mental health crises. Officers receive instruction on how to identify signs of cognitive impairment, how to modify their communication strategies, and how to de-escalate situations involving vulnerable populations. Yet none of this training manifests in Hop's actions. When Officer Daria Jalali arrives on scene, the situation reaches its third critical failure point. Jalali now has the opportunity to assess the situation independently, to recognize that something is wrong with how this arrest is unfolding, and to intervene. Colorado law is explicit about this duty. Officers are required to step in when they witness excessive force. They are required to report misconduct. This legal obligation exists precisely because the nature of police work creates situations where individual officers may lose perspective, where adrenaline and ego may override professional judgment, and where the presence of another professional can interrupt a dangerous trajectory before it results in serious harm. Jalali does not intervene. Instead, she participates. Together, the two officers drag Garner to the patrol vehicle, her body limp and unresisting, her verbal expressions of pain and confusion completely ignored. The second officer's presence doesn't moderate the situation. It amplifies it. Two uniformed officers now apply force to an 80-pound elderly woman who poses no threat, who isn't fleeing, who isn't fighting. The optics are devastating, but more importantly, the professional failure is complete. During this process, Garner asks for her credit card, the same card she tried to use at Walmart to pay for the merchandise, the same card that represents her original intent to resolve the situation lawfully. This request is ignored. The officers are focused entirely on the mechanics of detention, on forcing compliance, on completing the arrest. There is no pause to consider whether this level of force is necessary or appropriate. There is no reassessment of the situation based on Garner's obvious vulnerability and confusion. The arrest has become self-justifying. She must be arrested because the arrest has already begun, and to stop now would be to admit that the entire approach was wrong from the start. A concerned citizen witnesses at least part of this interaction and confronts Hop about the treatment of Garner. This moment is revealing for what it shows about Hop's understanding of accountability and public perception. Rather than showing any reflection or concern about how the arrest appeared to an outside observer, Hop immediately moves into justification mode. He reframes the narrative, describing Garner as stealing, refusing to stop, fighting with him. He presents himself as a professional forced to use necessary force against a non-compliant suspect. The concerned citizen, not having witnessed the entire interaction, accepts this explanation. But the body camera footage that will later emerge tells a completely different story. This gap between official narrative and documented reality represents one of the most significant aspects of this case. Hop doesn't just use excessive force. He then constructs a false narrative about what happened and presents that narrative as official record. His police report will later claim that Garner attempted to flee and that she was detained safely with only minor injuries. Neither of these claims is accurate. But without body camera footage, without witnesses willing to challenge the official version, without a determined effort to uncover the truth, these lies would have become the permanent record of what occurred. This is how misconduct perpetuates itself within law enforcement systems, not just through the original wrongdoing, but through the layers of false documentation, mutual protection, and institutional resistance to accountability that follow. The true depth of misconduct in this case doesn't fully reveal itself during the arrest itself, but rather in what happens afterward. In the hours that follow when Karen Garner sits injured and confused in a police station while the officers who hurt her celebrate their actions just feet away. This is where the case transcends a single incident of excessive force and becomes something far more disturbing. A window into a culture of cruelty that exists within certain law enforcement environments, protected by institutional structures that prioritize officer protection over accountability. After Garner is transported to the Loveland Police Department, she's placed on a bench in a holding area. The body camera footage from this period is clinically devastating. Garner sits largely motionless, her injured arm hanging uselessly at her side. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't demand medical attention. She doesn't protest her treatment. She simply sits, withdrawn and quiet, in visible discomfort. This behavior is entirely consistent with someone experiencing both physical trauma and psychological shock. Her shoulder has been dislocated. Her arm has been fractured. She's been violently forced to the ground, handcuffed, and transported to an unfamiliar location by people who responded to her confusion with aggression. For someone with dementia and sensory aphasia, this experience represents a complete collapse of comprehensible reality. The policy requirements for handling detainees who may be injured are clear and exist for obvious reasons. Officers have a duty of care toward people in their custody. When someone exhibits signs of injury or distress, medical evaluation isn't optional. It's mandatory. But the officers who arrested Garner don't summon medical personnel. They don't document her injuries with the seriousness they deserve. They don't treat her as a vulnerable person who has just experienced a traumatic event. Instead, they leave her sitting alone while they gather in another area to review the body camera footage of the arrest. What happens next should be impossible to believe, yet it's captured on video with perfect clarity. Hop, Jalali, and other officers gather around a computer screen to watch the body camera footage. Their demeanor is not reflective or concerned. They're not reviewing the footage with an eye toward documentation or honest assessment of tactics. Instead, they watch it as entertainment. They laugh. They make jokes. They fist bump each other. When the footage reaches the moment of violent takedown, when Garner's arm is being twisted and her body forced to the ground, an officer says, "I love it." Another responds with laughter and agreement. This reaction reveals something that goes beyond individual moral failure. It demonstrates a complete dehumanization of the person they've just injured. Garner is not a 73-year-old woman with dementia who deserves compassion and appropriate care. She's not even a criminal who deserves basic dignity despite her alleged offense. She has become, in their eyes, a prop in a story about their own competence and toughness. The violence they inflicted becomes a source of pride, a demonstration of their willingness to use force, a moment worth celebrating with colleagues. When Hop describes his experience to the other officers, his language is telling. He talks about being excited. He describes the encounter with enthusiasm, as though it were a positive professional experience, rather than a situation that resulted in serious injury to a vulnerable person. He minimizes Garner's size and age, she's so little, but frames this fact not as a reason he should have used less force, but as something that made the encounter easier to manage. There's no reflection on whether different tactics might have been more appropriate. There's no concern about the injuries she sustained. There's only satisfaction at having asserted control and demonstrated physical dominance. Jalali's participation in this culture is particularly significant because of her role as the second officer on scene. She had the opportunity to interrupt the trajectory of this incident at multiple points. She could have questioned Hop's tactics during the arrest. She could have advocated for medical attention for Garner afterward. She could have declined to participate in the celebratory review of footage showing an elderly woman being injured. Instead, she becomes an active participant in the misconduct, not just through her failure to intervene, but through her choice to join in the casual cruelty that follows. When she describes watching body camera footage as my favorite thing to watch, she's not making an abstract statement about police work. She's specifically discussing footage of this arrest, footage showing Garner in pain and confusion. The psychological mechanisms at work here deserve examination because they're not unique to these officers or this department. They represent broader patterns that emerge when law enforcement culture prioritizes toughness over compassion, control over de-escalation, and loyalty to fellow officers over accountability to the public. When officers are socialized into an environment where using force is celebrated, where showing restraint is viewed as weakness, and where questioning a colleague's tactics is seen as betrayal, individual judgment becomes subordinate to group dynamics. The officers watching this footage together aren't independently assessing what happened. They're reinforcing a shared narrative that justifies and celebrates the use of force, regardless of whether that force was necessary or appropriate. This group reinforcement serves a protective function. By collectively agreeing that the arrest was justified and even praiseworthy, the officers insulate themselves from doubt or moral questioning. If everyone agrees it was good police work, then it must have been good police work. If everyone thinks the footage is entertaining rather than disturbing, then there's nothing disturbing about it. This mutual validation creates an echo chamber where misconduct can flourish unchallenged, where excessive force becomes normalized, and where officers lose the ability to accurately assess their own behavior. The presence of Sergeant Metzler at the station during this period adds another layer of institutional failure. As a supervisor, Metzler holds specific responsibilities for ensuring that arrests are conducted properly, that injuries are documented and addressed, and that officers under his command maintain professional standards. When Garner is brought in obviously injured, when officers are gathered watching body camera footage and celebrating the arrest, Metzler has multiple opportunities to recognize that something has gone seriously wrong and to take corrective action. He doesn't. The investigation will later reveal that Metzler not only failed to provide appropriate oversight, but actively attempted to suppress the body camera footage that documented the misconduct. This attempted suppression represents perhaps the most cynical aspect of the entire case. Metzler understands that the footage is damaging. He recognizes that if it becomes public, it will raise serious questions about the conduct of his officers and his own supervisory failures. His response is not to address the underlying problems, not to ensure accountability, not to implement corrective measures. Instead, he attempts to hide the evidence. This decision transforms the incident from a case of individual officer misconduct into a case of institutional cover-up, demonstrating that the problems extend far beyond the actions of two patrol officers. The medical neglect that Garner experiences while sitting in the police station represents a separate category of misconduct with its own serious implications. She has sustained multiple injuries that are obvious to anyone paying attention. Her arm hangs at an unnatural angle. She's in visible discomfort. She's largely unresponsive to her surroundings, yet hours pass without proper medical evaluation. This neglect violates basic standards of care and exposes the department to massive liability, but more importantly, it demonstrates a callous disregard for human suffering that should be incompatible with any form of public service. The legal framework surrounding duty of care in custody situations exists precisely because detained individuals are rendered completely vulnerable. They cannot seek medical attention for themselves. They cannot leave to get help. They are entirely dependent on the officers who have custody of them. This dependency creates a legal and moral obligation, one that is well established in both statute and case law. Officers cannot simply arrest someone, injure them in the process, and then ignore obvious signs that medical intervention is needed. Yet, this is exactly what happens to Garner during her detention. When the officers fail to provide necessary medical care, they're not just being negligent. They're violating the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, as applied to pretrial detainees through the 14th Amendment. Courts have consistently held that deliberate indifference to serious medical needs constitutes a constitutional violation. In Garner's case, the indifference is not just deliberate but documented. The officers know she's been injured. They caused the injuries. They then choose to prioritize their own entertainment over her medical needs, watching and re-watching footage of the arrest while she sits alone in pain. The institutional response to Garner's arrest, both in the immediate aftermath and in the days and weeks that follow, reveals systemic problems that enable patterns of misconduct to persist. When an arrest results in serious injuries to a vulnerable person, multiple oversight mechanisms should activate automatically. Supervisors should review the incident. Use of force reports should be scrutinized. Medical documentation should be examined. Training deficiencies should be identified and addressed. But these mechanisms only function if the people operating them are committed to genuine accountability, rather than protecting their colleagues and their department's reputation. The false reporting that Hopp engages in represents a crucial element of how misconduct perpetuates itself. In his official report, he characterizes Garner as attempting to flee and describes the detention as safe with only minor injuries. These characterizations are factually false, but they serve important protective functions. If accepted as accurate, they justify the level of force used. They transform a case of excessive force against a vulnerable person into a routine arrest of a non-compliant suspect. They create an official narrative that shields Hopp from accountability and makes it more difficult for anyone reviewing the case to identify problems. This gap between documented reality and official narrative exists in countless cases where misconduct occurs. Officers know that their reports will likely be accepted at face value, that supervisors rarely have the time or inclination to scrutinize every arrest in detail, and that, absent compelling evidence to the contrary, the officer's version of events becomes the official version. Body cameras were supposed to address this problem by creating an objective record of the police encounters. But body cameras only provide accountability if the footage is actually reviewed, if supervisors are willing to acknowledge what the footage shows, and if institutional culture supports honest assessment rather than reflexive defense of officer conduct. The celebration of violence, the medical neglect, the false reporting, and the attempted cover-up. Each of these represents a separate failure, but together they form a pattern that defines the culture within this particular law enforcement agency. This isn't about one bad officer having a bad day. This is about an institutional environment where multiple officers and supervisors engage in or tolerate serious misconduct, where the mechanisms that should prevent such misconduct fail completely, and where the priority becomes protecting the department rather than serving the community. The legal aftermath of Karen Garner's arrest demonstrates both the power and the limitations of accountability mechanisms within American law enforcement. When the body camera footage finally becomes public, the response is immediate and forceful. The images of officers laughing while reviewing footage of an elderly woman's violent arrest prove impossible to defend or explain away. Public outrage forces institutional action that might never have occurred otherwise. But this case also reveals how rare such accountability actually is. How many failures must align before misconduct is properly addressed, and how much the system relies on extraordinary circumstances rather than routine oversight. Garner's decision to file a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act represents the most common avenue for seeking accountability when constitutional violations occur during police encounters. This statute, originating from Reconstruction-era efforts to protect newly freed slaves from abuse by state officials, allows individuals to sue government actors who violate their civil rights. The legal standard requires proving that officers violated clearly established constitutional rights. In this case, the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable seizure, which includes the use of excessive force during arrest. The strength of Garner's case lies in the multiple layers of documented misconduct. The body camera footage shows the violent takedown. Medical records document the serious injuries. The station footage captures officers celebrating the arrest. Hopp's false report demonstrates consciousness of wrongdoing. Metzler's attempted suppression of evidence proves institutional complicity. Each element reinforces the others, creating an overwhelming narrative of constitutional violation that makes the case nearly impossible to defend. But cases with such comprehensive documentation are extraordinarily rare. Most excessive force complaints lack video evidence, rely on conflicting testimony, and die in the gray area between what happened and what can be proven. The City of Loveland's decision to settle the lawsuit for $3 million reflects a calculated assessment of liability and public perception. Settlements allow municipalities to resolve cases without admitting wrongdoing, without setting legal precedents, and without subjecting their officers and practices to the scrutiny of a public trial. The money comes from taxpayers, not from the officers who committed the misconduct or the supervisors who enabled it. This financial structure means that the people most responsible for what happened to Garner face no personal economic consequences, while the community bears the cost of their actions. This disconnect between individual responsibility and institutional liability represents a fundamental problem in police accountability. When officers know that any damages awarded in lawsuits will be paid by their employer rather than from their own resources, the financial deterrent effect largely disappears. The officer can continue their career, often without significant discipline, while taxpayers fund the settlement. Some jurisdictions have explored requiring officers to carry personal liability insurance or creating systems where officers bear at least partial financial responsibility for sustained misconduct findings. But these reforms remain rare and politically difficult to implement. The criminal charges brought against Hopp and Jalali mark a significant departure from typical outcomes in excessive force cases. Most officers who use questionable force never face criminal prosecution. District attorneys, who work closely with police departments and rely on officer testimony in their cases, often decline to prosecute fellow law enforcement personnel except in the most egregious circumstances. The decision to charge both officers here reflects the undeniable nature of the evidence and the impossibility of constructing any reasonable defense for their actions. Hopp's conviction for second-degree assault under Colorado law carries a 5-year prison sentence, a substantial consequence by the standards of police accountability, yet still modest given the severity of what occurred. The conviction establishes legal precedent that officers can be held criminally responsible when their use of force crosses a line from professional mistake into criminal assault. But the rarity of such prosecutions means this precedent has limited deterrent effect across the broader law enforcement community. Officers know that criminal charges remain unlikely even when their conduct is questionable, and convictions are rarer still. Jalali's charges for failure to intervene and failure to report represent an even more significant legal development. Colorado law explicitly requires officers to stop colleagues who are using excessive force and to report such misconduct when they witness it. These requirements recognize that police misconduct often occurs in the presence of multiple officers, and that creating a legal duty to intervene can interrupt violent situations before they escalate. But laws requiring intervention only matter if they're actually enforced, and Jalali's prosecution sends a clear message that passive participation in misconduct carries consequences. The institutional changes that follow this case, the resignations, the terminations, the policy reviews, represent the kind of reform that only occurs after catastrophic failure and public exposure. These changes are reactive rather than proactive, addressing problems that should never have existed in the first place. A properly functioning police department would have identified Hopp's aggressive tendencies long before he broke an elderly woman's arm. A healthy institutional culture would have prevented officers from celebrating violence. Effective supervision would have caught false reporting and ensured proper medical care for injured detainees. The question that haunts this case is how many similar incidents occur without body camera footage, without determined attorneys, without family members who refuse to accept official explanations, without media coverage that forces institutional response. Garner's case becomes public because multiple systems of documentation and advocacy align. But for every case like hers that receives scrutiny, how many disappear into police files as routine arrests, their excessive force unreported and unexamined? The broader implications extend beyond individual accountability to systemic questions about how American law enforcement trains, supervises, and disciplines its officers. The failures here are not primarily failures of written policy. Loveland had policies requiring de-escalation with mentally ill individuals, requiring medical care for injured detainees, requiring truthful reporting, requiring supervisory review of force incidents. The policies existed. They simply weren't followed, and the systems that should ensure compliance failed completely. This gap between policy and practice reveals the limitations of reform efforts that focus exclusively on updating rules and procedures. New policies matter only if officers are trained to implement them, if supervisors enforce them consistently, if violations result in meaningful consequences, and if institutional culture supports compliance rather than subversion. Creating that alignment requires changing not just what police departments say they do, but how they actually function at every level. The $3 million paid to Garner provides financial compensation but cannot restore her physical health, cannot erase the trauma, cannot return her sense of safety and dignity. Her daughter's statement about the lasting impact, the fear of going outside, the loss of arm function, the need for assistance with basic daily activities, describes harm that extends far beyond the immediate physical injuries. For someone in the final years of life, this kind of trauma doesn't heal. It becomes a permanent condition that shapes every remaining day. The satisfaction expressed by Garner's family at Hopp's 5-year sentence reflects a rare occurrence in police accountability cases, actual criminal consequences for serious misconduct. But even this outcome, more substantial than most excessive force cases achieve, reveals the challenges of meaningful reform. 5 years for breaking an elderly woman's arm, for lying about it, for celebrating it afterward. This represents justice only in comparison to the many cases where officers face no consequences whatsoever. The standard for accountability remains disturbingly low. What separates this case from countless others is not the severity of the misconduct, but the completeness of the documentation and the determination of advocates who refuse to let it disappear. The body camera footage provides irrefutable evidence. The station video captures the celebration. The medical records prove the injuries. The attorney builds an undeniable case. The media coverage creates public pressure. The family persists. Each element is necessary, and the absence of anyone might have allowed the misconduct to stand unaddressed. This case ultimately stands as both an example of accountability working and a demonstration of how rarely that accountability is achieved. It shows that officers can be held responsible for excessive force, that departments can be forced to pay for institutional failures. The criminal prosecution is possible when misconduct is severe and documented. But it also reveals how much must go right for accountability to occur, how many barriers must be overcome, and how dependent justice is on circumstances that cannot be replicated in most cases. The real question is not whether the system can produce accountability in extraordinary cases with overwhelming evidence, but whether it can do so routinely in ordinary cases before the damage becomes catastrophic and irreversible.